Yes, you're very welcome back to this special Women in Northern Ireland conference, a special gathering to coincide with International Women's Day this week and to mark 25 years of the Equality Commission. We are now delighted to reveal some new research which was commissioned by the Equality Commission, and for this I'd like to invite three panellists to the stage now, if you wouldn't mind taking your seats. That's Roisin Mallon, Dr. Catherine Wright and Professor Ruth McAreavey, and they'll come up and join me here on the stage. This research is entitled The Impact of Brexit on Women in Northern Ireland, and our three speakers will take you through why it was commissioned and the findings. I'll first introduce you to Roisin Mallon. Roisin is Director of the Dedicated Mechanism Unit at the Equality Commission. She will explain how this research came about as part of the Brexit Northern Ireland Protocol and Windsor Framework. Roisin, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted that we're launching this research at today's conference. It's independent research and it was commissioned by the Equality Commission. And I want to begin by thanking Catherine and Ruth and also Rebecca Donaldson from the Newcastle University for their excellent research report. So this is very unique research. It's the first research of its kind. And what it does is that it presents a high-level preliminary analysis of the impact of Brexit on women and girls in Northern Ireland. And that includes actual and perceived impact. And we commissioned this report further to our role with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission as the dedicated mechanism. Some of you here will know that after Brexit, a dedicated mechanism was set up by the UK government. And before I turn to the report, I just want to briefly set the scene in terms of some of the legal context for this report. So, as many of you here will know, in Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, which previously was known as the Protocol, the UK government made an important commitment to uphold certain equality and human rights in Northern Ireland and to uphold those and not diminish them as a result of Brexit. And there's really two parts to this commitment. They also committed to keep pace with any changes that the EU might make to 6 equality directives that were in Annex 1 of the Windsor Framework. So that included a number of gender directives, directives which prior to Brexit had really helped to strengthen rights for women here against discrimination and harassment, both inside and outside the workplace. And over the last 3 years, the Commission, with the Human Rights Commission, have been working to uphold, to hold the UK government to account in relation to that commitment. And we've also been working in partnership with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in terms of matters that relate to the all-island dimension of that Windsor Framework Article 2 commitment. So I think it's important just to briefly reflect on why the UK government made that commitment, including in the context of women's rights here. And indeed, it was made in recognition of the fact that equality and human rights were really at the core of the Good Friday Agreement. They were really central to it, and that included gender rights. So if you take, for example, the Good Friday Agreement affirmed the right to equal opportunity in all social and economic activity, regardless of gender and other equality grounds. And it also affirmed, in terms of women, the right to full and equal political participation. And it was these and other equality and human rights that underpinned the peace process here. And at a time of major constitutional change, when, of course, the UK left the EU, there was a recognition that these rights were important at that time. And that has actually proved to be very true and still remains the case. Indeed, we know that there's a very high level of public support here for that commitment by the UK government, as well as the work of the Commission's the dedicated mechanism. We carried out a public awareness survey last year, and we found that a substantial proportion of respondents to that survey felt that that commitment in the Windsor Framework was important to them. And the scope and the outworkings, and indeed the significance of this commitment by the UK government not to reduce certain equality and human rights post-Brexit became very evident last week, and you may have seen it highlighted in the media, where we had the High Court decision in Belfast in the legacy cases, and those were cases in which both the Equality Commission and the Human Rights Commission intervened. And what we found in that case for the very first time is that the court held that the UK government had breached its commitment under Windsor Framework Article 2. And significantly, as regards certain provisions in the Legacy Act, it said that those provisions that were in breach were disapplied and had no force. So I think what is very clear from that judgment is that a breach of Windsor Framework Article 2 can have very serious ramifications, not just for our Assembly here when they're passing laws, but also for the UK government. So I want to turn now to the research report, and you'll hear shortly from Catherine and Ruth, and indeed they reflect what many women who they spoke to perceived that Brexit had already impacted on their day-to-day lives. And I think what's significant about this research is that for the very first time, this research has captured the voices of a range of women here who felt that Brexit had impacted negatively on their lives. And it's their contribution that has made this research so unique, but also so valuable. So critically, this research provides a very robust evidence base in terms of holding the UK government to account, including in terms of its international human rights obligations relating to women. And we know, for example, that the UN committee that monitors the UK's government's compliance with its obligations in its last report on the UK in 2019 had already identified areas of concern that the UK government needed to address post-Brexit. For example, it called on the UK government to ensure that the rights of women here were not reduced post-Brexit, and that UK laws keep pace with progress on women's rights in the EU. And it also called on the UK government to ensure that the loss of EU funding did not lead to gaps in support and services for women and girls, including securing alternative sources of funding. And what you'll hear shortly is that these are all key matters that are covered by this research report. And indeed, they're also key matters that the Equality Commission has been raising. And many of you here will know that the recent loss of EU funding for many organisations in Northern Ireland, including for a number of women's groups, and which provided vital support services to some of the most vulnerable people in our society, was a devastating blow. And this is such an important issue for equality groups here that the Commission is now commissioning further research to look at this in terms of how the loss of EU funding has impacted on different groups, including women, and in the context of the rollout of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So another matter that the Commission has been raising, together with the two other commissions, is about the risk of increasing divergence of equality and human rights on the island of Ireland. And we have been calling on the UK government and the executive to keep pace with EU laws that would strengthen rights for women here and other equality groups, even if they don't have to do so under the Windsor Framework. And I want to just very briefly talk about the Pay Transparency Directive, because I think that's a real case in point here. This is a directive which strengthens rights relating to equal pay between women and men through gender pay reporting and strengthened enforcement mechanisms. And it was passed by the EU in June 2023. Now, what this means is that Ireland and other member states must give effect to this directive by June 2026. And if Northern Ireland had remained in the EU, those rights through that directive would have come into Northern Ireland. So if this directive is not given effect in Northern Ireland, then rights relating to equal pay will fall behind those in the Republic of Ireland. And indeed, we already know that rights here have fallen behind those in Great Britain, where there's already gender pay reporting mechanisms in place. And the views of the Commission with the Human Rights Commission is that the UK government and the executive must keep pace with the vast majority of provisions in that Pay Transparency Directive further to their obligations in the Windsor Framework, so as to strengthen rights here and to protect against pay discrimination. So I want to finish by saying, in conclusion, that this is a really important and a significant piece of research. and in due course it will help shape the Commission's own recommendations in this area. And what we hope to do is we want to engage with women, we want to hear from women directly, we want to hear from representative organisations in relation to our own draft recommendations so that they can inform our work in this area. And once we finalise our views, then of course we'll be pressing for change, including with the Executive and the Government. And what is vital is that the findings of this research and the views of the Commission and of women impacted by Brexit, as well as other equality and human rights stakeholders, are not only listened to but are actually acted on, so that there is tangible outcomes that make a difference to people's lives here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roisin. So let me introduce to you Dr. Catherine Wright and Professor Ruth McAreavey. Catherine is a senior lecturer in international politics at Newcastle University. Her research concerns the implementation of the UN Women, Peace and Security Agenda at local, national and international level. And Ruth is Professor of Sociology at Newcastle University. Her research focuses on social inequalities, especially in a rural context, international migration and research ethics. Really looking forward to hearing what the findings are. Please welcome Dr. Catherine Wright and Professor Ruth McAreavey.
Thank you, Donna. So, this research that Ruth and I and also Rebecca Donaldson carried out took place, was quite a busy period of time. So what did we do? And I think it's important to note as kind of social scientists, actually the limitations of the research. This is a high-level preliminary analysis of the socio-economic impact of Brexit on women in Northern Ireland, actual, perceived and potential. And we undertook this research from November 2022 to August 2023. And I think Ruth and Rebecca will agree it was a pretty intense period of our working lives. So it provides some really important insights, but there's certainly more research to be done here. The research would not have been possible without the support of our steering group, so we want to thank the Women's Resource Development Agency, Women's Platform and the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network. It also wouldn't have been possible without the women who participated in the focus groups that we conducted, and we're also thankful to those from the third sector who gave their time to participate in our expert seminar, all to be interviewed so we could find out a little bit more about how Brexit was impacting the women that they represent. The other caveat here is that Brexit overlaps with a number of other crises, so including but not limited to the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the war in Ukraine, and the political stalemate that we've seen in Northern Ireland, which has just ended. It's at times then difficult to distinguish what is attributable to Brexit and what is not. That being said, the report makes recommendations for the UK government, the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and others. So our focus groups pointed to perceptions amongst women that Brexit was a highly gendered project from the outset, both in terms of who was allowed to speak on Brexit and also whose concerns were centred in bringing about Brexit. This reflects wider research on gender and Brexit, which in particular notes how the language used in the Brexit campaigns was masculinized, drawn from business, so examples including kind of talk of deal making, the use of military metaphors, for example, kind of equating Brexit to the Battle of Trafalgar. And such kind of framings contribute to understanding how men's concerns, and I put that in inverted commas here, and masculinized politics regarding security, the market, and kind of strength came to be prioritized. They came to be how we understood Brexit. The focus groups now research, but also kind of the broader setting of Brexit, also acknowledge that kind of women's voices have been silenced on Brexit, and this has particular impacts in Northern Ireland. And this was something that was really felt by many of the women that we spoke to. They perceived that they could not voice opinions on Brexit publicly, and some of these issues have come through in the panels this morning, such as the trolling. And this is very much reflective of wider research on Northern Ireland, notably here by Catherine Turner and Aisling Swain, which identifies how women in public life in Northern Ireland who speak about politics or not experience what they talk about as persistent low levels of gendered intimidation, which falls outside the scope of law and its related security policy, but still has this silencing effect. And this threat of violence and intimidation was something that's also been noted, for example, by the chair of the Northern Ireland Committee, Simon Hoare MP, and he pointed out in early 2023, so when we were in the midst of this research, that the last time that committee had had an all-women panel on Northern Ireland, there was an unacceptable level of social media abuse and threat. Added to this perception of Brexit as a gendered project, there's kind of another aspect here which has particular impacts on women by design. And that was actually the lack of meaningful consultation with the third and also the women's sector in Northern Ireland on what Brexit meant and how it would impact them. And this is by both the UK government, but also the European Union. And where this consultation did take place, it was very limited in form. And there was a perception that it was just a tick box exercise, and that actually the serious issues that were being raised about the impact of Brexit on women in Northern Ireland weren't being taken seriously by the people negotiating Brexit. So we turn to kind of gender perceptions of Brexit. So while there was no overall gender gap in voting in Northern Ireland in the 2016 referendum on the UK's membership of the EU, women, as we know from this room, I'm looking at you all now, are not a homogeneous group. It's worth noting here that younger women were more likely to be pro-Remain, and in the border region, and this is quite significant, only 28% of Leave voters were women. More recently, a gap has emerged between men and women's perceptions of Brexit. So in the report, we highlight some research conducted by Queen's University Belfast for an Economic and Social Research Council-funded project called A Place Between. And we see here that a clear gender gap is beginning to emerge or has emerged in relation to perceptions on Brexit, and that research looking at perceptions of the protocol at the time. So, for example, 39% of men compared to 24% of women in Northern Ireland polled in October 2022 either agreed or strongly agreed that Brexit was a good thing for the UK, so double the number of men, almost, while 71% of women and only 53% of men disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. This same polling shows us that women tend to be more distrustful of the key driver of Brexit, that being the UK government, than men in regard to the protocol. So this raises an interesting question of where this gender difference in perceptions and trust comes from. So Brexit, as we keep coming back to in the report, is highly technocratic. It's complex, it's moving. No one can really claim to be an expert on Brexit because Brexit is in many ways impossible to understand. So understanding what it means in practice is no easy task. This is further complicated by the lack of clear, accessible information on what Brexit means and a growing sense of distrust that the government implementing it even understands Brexit. Our focus group identified that Brexit, and the Brexit campaign specifically, so back in 2016, became a moment, as one woman put it, that it became acceptable for government officials to lie. Other women identified misinformation, including from government ministers, as contributing to their lack of trust in the politicians who were promising to deliver Brexit. And added to this is the information vacuum which emerged, where despite the best efforts of women to identify reliable sources of information on Brexit and what it means for their everyday lives, particularly close to the border, they kind of struggled to do so, and that had some very real repercussions. Another example of this impact of a lack of trust is something that came out in relation to Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act. So equality issues, I'm sure most of you are familiar, were addressed in Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, and that creates a statutory obligation on public authorities in carrying out their functions related to Northern Ireland to have due regard to the need to promote equality of opportunity between the 9 equality categories, and that includes men and women. Yet our research identified misunderstandings of Section 75 by government officials in Northern Ireland. And this resulted in concerns being raised that issues that impact women disproportionately as compared to men, and also vice versa, including Brexit, are not being addressed by gender-specific solutions. And this has resulted in, again, perpetuating this perception of a lack of trust in government officials to uphold these equality duties. So this lack of trust was a real kind of recurring theme that came through. So amidst this kind of perceived slippage in attention being given to women's status in Northern Ireland, the growing kind of mistrust of women in Northern Ireland in trusting the government to deliver for their best interests, we hit another obstacle. So Brexit has seen the UK withdraw from providing data to the European Institute for Gender Equality, is one example. And this has been a crucial tool not only for benchmarking the status of women in Northern Ireland, but also as an advocacy tool used by the third and women's sector to hold government to account. There is a danger then that going forward, it will not be possible to comprehend as fully as we previously could how Brexit has impacted women's lives in Northern Ireland. And this is going to do nothing to improve the lack of trust among women concerning Brexit as a project. So one of the recommendations we make in the report is that the UK continues to collect data on a nation-specific basis, which is comparable to this EU data to help mitigate the impact of Brexit here. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Catherine has already introduced and talk about some other topics that we came across when we were doing the research. And I think it's virtually impossible to convey how much fear and uncertainty in equal measure were generated because of the extended Brexit process. Women repeatedly spoke about how the Troubles brought uncertainty around everyday life, such as what tomorrow would bring, what the prospects would be for their family, and they really did not want to return to those days. And as somebody who grew up in the 70s in a border area, I completely understand that fear, and sometimes it can be really hard to pinpoint exactly what that means. And a lot of the women talked about the remoteness of Westminster politicians from that lived reality. And Brexit seemed to unravel a lot of the safety that the Good Friday Agreement had put in place. People talked at length about how technical Brexit was and how that means that it's entirely reliant on interpretation by lawyers and other specialists. And for this reason, complications and challenges will need to be played out in the courts of law, and that's a process that has really only begun, and it's going to continue for some time. We interviewed highly specialised lawyers, highly specialised individuals who talked about how they sometimes struggle to understand the outworkings of Brexit. And Brexit also interconnects with a lot of aspects of everyday life. Women we talked to described how Northern Ireland was not properly considered by Westminster politicians when Brexit was conceived, and at least if it was not a major concern. The way in which the Belfast Good Friday Agreement has enduring implications for protecting the rights of citizens and the responsibilities of government was often overlooked. And Brexit will make the Good Friday Agreement more challenging to implement because of some of the issues that Roisin has talked about around keeping pace and not allowing rights to recede. So it becomes really difficult then to untangle one issue from another. For example, the intersection of migration, Brexit, and women's rights was apparent amongst migrant women experiencing domestic violence. We found evidence that they were often unaware of their rights due to complicated legal circumstances. Some women were told by their partners that they didn't need to apply for their UK migration status because they would sort out Irish citizenship. And as one advocacy worker explained to us, this is more misinformation and illegitimate information within the coercive control kind of sphere of domestic abuse. And we talked about coercive control earlier, and that did come up in our research. Another person explained how it's hard to know what you're losing as a consequence of things that simply aren't happening. Others talked about how their rights in the workplace were potentially going to be eroded because they saw those rights being upheld by the European Union and that the European Union advocated for their rights. The confusion generated by uncertainty about what would happen next is closely linked to the lack of trust in government, and Catherine has already talked about that. So, as Roisin has explained, Article 2 commits to uphold certain rights, such as maternity. And women we spoke to, including those representing a charity with a large membership, talked about the lack of trust in government around this issue. And talking about how they cannot trust Westminster to protect their rights. Nobody knows what's going to happen to workers' rights, to maternity rights, to holiday leave, and a number of other rights. So it was clear from the women we spoke to that Brexit distracted from everyday issues that needed actual action on the ground. And gender equality was not seen as a priority for the UK government. So, for example, the way in which at one point the UK government proposed to disregard its international obligation did not help to build trust. And that happened in the autumn of 22 when it sought through the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill to disapply parts of the protocol. The UK committed through the Brexit process to ensuring that certain equality and human rights in Northern Ireland, which are set out in the Good Friday Agreement, would not be reduced by Brexit. And other commitments, which we won't go into in detail today, include dynamic alignment between the law in Northern Ireland and changes to EU equality law across 6 directives. And the Northern Ireland Act means that the Northern Ireland legislature cannot reduce those rights. But there's a real need for clarity in the relationship between domestic and EU law. And that includes ongoing monitoring, and we make particular recommendations around that. So questions remain around what constitutes a potential breach of upholding equality and human rights laws, such as in relation to health. And this is an unfolding picture. We're really in the early days of Brexit happening. Brexit is certainly not done at this point. And it will be played out in courts of law. But it's already clear that the burden is on small organisations to challenge the state. And we've already heard some discussion about the role of third sector organisation in filling in important gaps in everyday life. And there's an additional burden that we have identified through our research where they're having to challenge some decisions being made by service providers. The law is so complex that some advocacy groups we interviewed described how they attended a specialist clinic in York University to ask for help on specific cases. And we also spoke to legal experts who conveyed the complexity of Brexit, explaining how it would be impossible for any one individual to be right across all of the ramifications. So it is really, really complex and intertwines with so many other factors. And if we think more particularly about ongoing protection of women's rights, one woman explained to us how she thought it's important to view Brexit within the wider agenda. The rollback of rights over the last decade or so, she perceived Brexit as a human right issue. And it's tied up with that sort of fundamental point about women as humans and about being entitled to have basic human rights. Women talked about how Brexit was a gendered project. They voiced concerns over whether their rights would continue to be guaranteed in the future. Some have argued that the loss of EU law underpinning access to healthcare could be argued to be a diminishment in itself. And we also found how some NHS infrastructure workers have been found to not fully understand the rights of frontier workers. And in fact, the NHS infrastructure itself is not really set up to deal with the complexities. And a lack of clarity amongst frontline workers means that if their organisation don't understand what Brexit means, legal confusion can result. So health trusts can charge for healthcare by default without a full appreciation of the nuances of the law. And there's a real need for a better understanding of the implications for healthcare and health provision. And one employee of an advocacy organisation explained to us how their advisors can fight for months to get charges dropped because the health trust does not accept proof of status and entitlement to avail of services. So you can see there where the already stretched third sector organisations are having to go into that sort of space of protecting rights and fighting to get cases heard in an already sort of hard financial climate. And it also has the potential to bring service providers into the advocacy space if health workers indeed are trying to support their service users. And this is not a good use of resources in the climate that we're facing at the moment. So moving on then to think a little bit about the economy and resources. And as Roisin has already highlighted, this is a really important issue, especially if we think about EU funds and the investment that provided for third sector organisation and for support to women. But as Catherine has already said, it's really early in this process. We can't, at this moment in time, we can't fully appreciate the outworkings of Brexit. And it's really difficult as well to pinpoint cause and effect because there have been so many other complex issues happening on the global stage. But the ongoing reduction in public expenditure by the UK government has left a large shadow over public service delivery. Welfare support services are much reduced. Over a decade of austerity policies have hollowed out the public service delivery, and this has a disproportionate impact on women. Many income support claimants are women. Lone parents are particularly vulnerable to the intersection of austerity, Brexit, and the cost of living crisis. Women we spoke to in border communities talked about how there were few investment opportunities. There did not seem to be evidence of government taking action there, and they were concerned about families leaving and going to America, England, Australia, because there were very few employment opportunities there. And then if we drill into EU funds, which have already been mentioned, the EU provided a lot of support for women's groups, for third sector organisations, and the loss of EU funds has been challenging for the sector, impacting on the continuation of services for women, including on key gender-related strategies. The break between EU funding and the Shared Prosperity Fund was not helpful. That gap has had a huge impact on third sector organisation, on women's groups, not only in terms of the loss of resources, but also in terms of the loss of continuity and the expertise within the sector. The control of decision-making, moreover, for shared prosperity funds has gone back to Westminster. And there's a real equality issue there because as a result, the way in which the shared prosperity funding allocations will comply with Section 75 duties is not at all clear. The Department of Levelling Up is not obliged to run equality impact assessments in the same way as departments in Northern Ireland would be. So the central allocation is problematic. There could be much less appreciation of the local context and of local priorities. So these are some of our key recommendations, and one thing which could be very powerful would be if UK Government, Northern Ireland Assembly opt to voluntarily align with future EU legislation. This would remove a lot of uncertainty, and it would help to shift expectations about access to rights in favour of women, especially those who are already marginalised within society. Catherine talked about data collection. Collecting data that is comparable to that collected by the EU on women will be crucial if women's rights are to be compared with EU states. This includes Gender Equality Index and Eurostat data. It will show if progress is being made in women's rights or if backsliding has occurred. It will allow for monitoring. And doing this would greatly reduce the need to track non-diminution of rights. The provision of clear, transparent and up-to-date information has not happened during the Brexit process, and Catherine talked about the information vacuum which creates a space for misinformation, and that is really, really highly problematic. And in some cases, this provided leverage to gatekeepers to advance their own positions. That gap needs to be closed through the provision of a single information point that is updated to capture ongoing developments in relation to Brexit and the rights of women. Ensuring that women have a voice will be important in the future. And the executive, it was very reassuring to hear this morning that the executive is prioritising a violence against women strategy. That is something that we think is really, really important. So finally, what of post-Brexit? We believe it's imperative that government listens to women, and ensuring that emerging structures are inclusive and progressive would be quite a shift from the way in which Brexit has been designed, negotiated and implemented. And we will end with the words of one woman who told us there was a sense that, certainly with women, that things were happening to them and not with them. And it would be really good if we could shift that narrative. Thank you.
Thank you for that research and the findings. So much in that, and I'm sure they are now available for people if they wish to read it in more detail at a later stage. I'm just going to take, if there's a quick question from the floor. If not, I'm going to ask Roisin a question. Right, from an Equality Commission's point of view, what was the one thing that in the findings that you thought stood out in regard to women's rights and how they were viewed in the Brexit scenario? What was shocking for you? What stood out? Is that on? Let me just say. Right up.
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there's quite a few significant findings in the research report. I think what was quite revealing was, though in some sense not surprising, was the lack of engagement with women and with the women's sector in terms of both the Brexit negotiations and as Brexit has been rolled out. So I think it was disheartening to find, despite, I have to say, the Equality Commission and others pressing for engagement by the EU and the UK government with women and with the women's sector, that didn't take place. So that was, I would say that was disappointing, but certainly one of the key points in the report. I think I've already mentioned about the loss of EU funding. I think it was shocking the way that ultimately was handled, the cliff edge cut off at the end of March that left many in the sector, including the women's sector, not knowing until the very last moment as to whether or not funding was going to continue and what the nature of that funding would be. So I think this research report just reinforces some of those key concerns by hearing directly from women as in terms of what was important to them.
And as one of our researchers mentioned, there's a time to go. There's still an awful lot of work to be done in this regard, in listening to women, not just the women coming forward, but for those in authority and in power, listening to their concerns.
No, absolutely. And I think, as I said, that's a central message when the Equality Commission met with the EU in October there. It was a central message was you have got to listen to equality and human rights stakeholders in Northern Ireland. You have got to hear directly from them, and you've got to take account of what they've said and act on it, because There just really has been limited engagement. I know there has been a little bit of progress since then in terms of some direct engagement, but I think there just needs a robust, formalised mechanism by which women here can feed into EU developments. We've already seen in the Pay Transparency Directive a really key piece of EU law that has come in, and there are further ones in the pipeline, and it's important that women's voices are heard from here in terms of that development. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Our thanks to Roisin Mallon, please, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Catherine Wright and Professor Ruth McAreevy. Thank you for your research and thank you for joining us on the stage here. Next, we move on to our next session in the conference, which is entitled Voices of Women in Northern Ireland. And I would like to invite Elaine, Louise, Yona and Kelly, if you could take your seat on the stage there. As they do so, let me introduce you to our next speaker on video, which is Grace Smith. And Grace studies at the Falls Women's Centre in Belfast. And Grace is going to tell us for the conference the difference that facility has made to her. Grace Smith.
Hi, I've been studying at the Falls Women's Centre for the past 4 years. This is my 4th and final year within my studies. I have 2 children and one of them actually uses the creche here. Without that being fully funded to me while I study here would be a loss for me because I wouldn't be able to continue my studies. It is within my own community and I am very proud that they offer this to me because there's not many universities or other places that would facilitate this, and without it I wouldn't be able to continue on with my studies.
Good, and our thanks to Grace, and we wish her all well in those studies. Now, Elaine Crowry is from the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and her role is to lobby elected representatives and decision makers on issues that affect women. Elaine is a specialist advisor to the Women and Equalities Commission Committee at Westminster. Elaine Crowry is going to say a few words. Thanks, Elaine.
Thanks very much. So my job title is Women's Sector Lobbyist. And whenever I say that to somebody who has never met one of the 5 other women sector lobbyists in the past, they don't necessarily know what it means. So I'm going to just explain that briefly now. Like you said, it's about lobbying decision makers, but also it's about lobbying on behalf of the women's sector. And just there in that last presentation, we heard about the impacts on the women's sector of things like the loss of funding after Brexit, and various other challenges that the women's sector in particular faces, and that the third sector, voluntary and community sector, civil society, whatever you want to call it, also faces. One of those being something somebody raised from the floor earlier in the day about things like conditions, pay, short-term contracts, all of those other things. It gives rise to the general impression that those of us who work in that sector are there out of a sort of vocational desire to be there. And that's true to a large degree, but I think we get too complacent as a society about the lower standards that come with, lower standards in terms of pay and rights and workplace conditions that come with that sector. But as well as that, a large part of my job is chairing and convening what we call a Women's Policy Group. The Women's Policy Group is a group of women in policy roles across Northern Ireland. So there's lots of women from the women's sector, but there's also women from trade unions, from human rights organisations, from the LGBT sector, and so on and so on. Lots and lots of women, including all 3 of my fellow panellists, one of whom is also a previous women's sector lobbyist. We meet regularly to work on issues on which we can speak with one voice. And when it comes to lobbying on behalf of the issues that women face in Northern Ireland, that's everything. There is literally no issue which doesn't affect women, pretty much. So one of the downsides of this job means you have to be over all of those issues, which is every issue. No big task. But you also have the advantage in the Women's Policy Group of having the expertise of lots of different people. So I may not know the detail on something that advocates from disability rights organisations will know about how a particular issue impacts women with disabilities particularly prominently, and so on and so forth. For nearly every issue that we face, if you face other marginalised identities as well as being a woman, you will face that issue from an even more disadvantaged point of view. And the Women's Policy Group allows us to gather all those views, to formulate our opinions, and then to lobby collectively. It's a lot easier to shove a door open when it's not just you shoving, but also the entire sector is behind you. Now, in terms of what issues we're lobbying on, there's a lot of things, like I said, literally everything. But I wanted to highlight a couple of key ones, the ones that keep coming up again and again. And I know we used the phrase a key issue to mean a very important issue, but these issues are also key issues in the sense that they act like keys. They unlock other issues and they unlock other things. One of the things lots of contributors today have spoken about is childcare and care in general. The women's sector has been lobbying for a childcare strategy since before I was in my professional working life. That's more than 20 years. We need as an actual strategy that's fit for purpose, etc. It needs investment, yes, but also it needs to see childcare as something that is not just a women's issue, but a society-wide issue. Another one that hasn't been mentioned as much is poverty. So poverty affects all of our society. We are a disproportionately poor society in comparison with our neighbours across the water and down south, but poverty affects women in particular ways. Women are more likely to live their lives, their adult lives, in poverty. They're more likely to be in poverty as pensioners. They're more likely to be in insecure jobs, on part-time work, and on low pay, 0 hours contracts, etc. affects women far more than men. And every single one of the decisions that was made around what we often call austerity, the various changes to welfare reforms in the last 14 years have disproportionately impacted on women and their children, particularly when they are lone parents, of which 93% of lone parent families in Northern Ireland are headed by women. So again, this accumulates. If you face disadvantages as being a lone parent, because of the austerity decisions, and you also happen to be a person with a disability or a person who faces other, like maybe they're an ethnic minority person, it just accumulates and accumulates. And we end up with, over the course of life, women having far fewer opportunities than men. And that is contributed to by childcare, because women can't work the same amount of hours as men. They tend to take the time off to look after their children, and then they take more time off to look after their parents. And then all of that feeds into the last major issue that we look at, and that I particularly have strong feelings about, which is violence against women and girls. We heard from the First Minister this morning that this is a top priority for the Executive Office. I believe that to be the case. I know that a lot of work has gone into the draft strategy, but that work needs to be matched by funding and by commitment and political will. Not shying away from parts of the strategy because they seem too brave. Those parts that reach into things like relationships and sexuality education in schools, for example, or those parts that get a little bit, out of people's comfort zone around how we talk about masculinities, for example, and gender stereotypes. Violence against women and girls does not discriminate. It touches almost everyone. But if you are experiencing poverty, or if you are dependent on your partner because you're taking care of a child and they're out at work, it impacts that a little bit harder. It is harder to escape and harder to get away. So none of these issues can be neatly separated from each other. We have to look at them all in the round. They're like a big, complicated Venn diagram. And the more issues you include, the bigger the Venn diagram gets, right? And that's why we have to lobby as a collective. A couple of notes that mention, just before I sit down, how we do this work. We hold sort of human rights as the baseline, as the standard. And this is how, by and large, we reach collective shared opinions on these things. Everybody may have their particular expertise and their particular issues that their organisation is fighting for, but if we have a baseline, then we'll all nearly always coalesce around a similar place. We look at best international practice, what's happening elsewhere, what has worked and what hasn't worked in other countries, and we continually talk about the issues around gender-neutral policymaking. And that is policymaking that acts as though there is no gendered impact to a policy like the two-child cap, which very obviously does have an impact. So we work evidence-based stuff, and we do a lot of our own research as well. So that's a very brief overview of what I do and why I do it, and I'm going to pass on to next panelist.
Thank you, Elaine. I'd love to be the woman who knows everything. You can always bluff if you don't. Louise Coyle is the director of the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, which strives to make society more equitable for rural women to be visible, to be influential, and to be valued. Its mission is to advance the participation and the recognition of rural women at all levels of society. So for a few minutes, let's hear from Louise Coyle. Thanks, Louise.
Hi, everybody. I thought I was going to be sitting there for the whole time, so I'm going to just gather myself a wee minute. Look, I work on behalf of rural women, and none of the issues that impact on women don't impact on rural women. But what I always say is that sometimes the solutions don't look the same, and that's what we really need to look at. I've been really encouraged by this event today at how many women who have been up here have self-declared as rural women, because quite often there's literally just me. If I'm in the room, it's usually just me, or if it's one of my colleagues, that's how it is. We're a small organisation, and sometimes it can feel like a kind of lonely space because you're kind of going, that glider is not going to fix the transport for us, I'm afraid. I had a really interesting journey here today because I had a meeting this morning that I had to speak at in Mahara. So there's no public transport from where I live to there. So I had to drive to there, and then I thought it's going to be really tight to get down through the traffic in Belfast. So I ended up then going to the park and ride and getting a bus to get me here on time. And that's what rural life is like. So even when you're using public transport, you invariably need a car. And our members will tell us that the top two issues for them are the caring and childcare and transport. Because without those, you can't participate in anything else. So you can't, talking about women having their voice heard and their space and their place, you can't get to those spaces and places. If you can't get there because you have a caring responsibility or because you have no transport, well, then your voice is not going to be heard, even if somebody has invited you. So, the difficulty it is in terms of decision-making spaces is that if they're not hearing those voices, they're not hearing what the issues are, they're not hearing and scoping out what the potential solutions are. And also, there's no two ways about it. It actually does cost more money sometimes to deliver in rural. Building a big snazzy childcare centre is not going to be the answer. You're probably going to need more solutions in more places, and per head of population, it's probably not giving you the same, cost per unit that, our decision makers work to. So all of those things kind of complicate things even more if you are a rural woman. In terms of Brexit and post-EU exit, that has been a huge issue from our members from the very beginning. I just happened, coincidentally, to be doing a piece of action research with our members just to update on how they were feeling about things at the time, and it traversed that whole year of pre-referendum, referendum and post-referendum. And it did not matter where politically, how women voted politically. More than 98% actually of our members were really concerned about the impacts of Brexit on them and their communities and their families. And that hasn't changed. The issues they're concerned about have kind of changed over the time since 2018, but actually their concern and their interest in the impact has not changed. And when you talk about EU structural funds, there's absolutely no question that how that was managed, that it's not like for like funding in terms of ESF to UK shared prosperity, and we know that because that has been delivered. What has not been delivered is any kind of clarity around EU structural funds of the Rural Development Programme, which actually invests about, at the last iteration was 600 million into rural areas here. And whilst the old programme, a bit like the piece, is kind of trickling out, there is absolutely nothing in place to replace that, not one thing. No clarity, no vision, no anything. Our executive under the last minister did propose a rural framework for Northern Ireland. It's there. It's kind of a high-level vision kind of statement. There's no actions, there's no resourcing, there's no clarity on what that might look like on the ground. And at the moment, it's kind of been sitting on ice like a lot of things have been because we've had no executive. But there's been no clarity at a UK level. So it's not just the lack of our government, it's actually the lack of the UK government actually taking some responsibility that has now transferred to them, and what are they going to do about it? And whilst a lot of it might be involved in like farming and farm families and things like that, it does cover rural affairs, it does cover community infrastructure, community investment in women. And to be honest with you, we have discussed a lot about structurally how women have been left behind here. Actually, the European Union didn't leave women behind. It did invest in women. It did see the value of women in leadership. It did see the value of women in rural communities. And to be honest, I think probably we all took it a wee bit for granted, certainly in rural areas. What rural women are kind of concerned about now is part of that EU structural funds includes what's called single farm payments. If you know about this, forgive me, I'm going to explain a tiny bit, but if you have a small farm, there's a recognition that it might not be hugely profitable, but it's really important to our social infrastructure and the way we live our lives rurally in Northern Ireland. And because we had similar countries in the EU, like ourselves, that weren't running massive acres and acres and acres of farms, there was a recognition that we still need that, and so they put some money into supporting farm families through a single farm payment. But what women understood really early, and what I was hearing way back in 2018 was, what about our single farm payment? Because women are the people who are managing the household budgets, and they know that every piece of machinery, every other bit of loan, or securing their home is built around that money coming in on a regular basis. It's sure, it's certain, they know it's coming. And to be honest with you, they really didn't want to gamble with it. And so they weren't very in favour of Brexit. And those are the very practical reasons why. So I don't want to take everybody else's time, but just, I suppose, we have a Rural Needs Act here. Lots of you in policy and decision making will be involved in that. What that does ask us to do is to take account of rural need. If any of you are ever worried about how to do that or what does that actually mean in reality, look, email me, give me a call, happy to have a chat. We talk with our members all the time. We're a membership organisation, so we hear all the time what they want and need. So if you're ever worried about how to fill in that lovely form or what you might do to make things differently, the earlier we can hear from you, the better, and we'll help to support you.
Thank you, Louise, flying the flag for women in rural areas. Fiona Monaghan is a project coordinator at the Women's Platform, which works to achieve gender equality for women and girls and make their voices heard. The Women's Platform has a special consultative status with the United Nations and feeds into its work in eliminating all forms of discrimination against women. So let's hear for a few minutes. Fiona Monaghan, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you very much. So, Women's Platform really acts as the link between the women's sector in Northern Ireland and the European and the international level. We're very much a policy-based organisation, so we would work with all the organisations on the panel and many others in the room, really, to bring the voices of women in Northern Ireland to European level and to UN, as we say. We were originally set up, actually, to act as the Northern Ireland coordination to the European Women's Lobby. And the lobby has just recently changed its statutes to include the UK specifically, despite Brexit. And that's something that, from our perspective, is really important because we want to keep those links to our European sisters for wider solidarity issues, but also so that Northern Ireland can keep pace with rights developments elsewhere in Europe. We haven't actually moved out of Europe in that sense. And in Northern Ireland, what we also do is we coordinate sector work on linking in with UN human rights standards, in particular on CEDAW, and that was mentioned earlier. So we would coordinate the civil society response to CEDAW, and it can be noted that since the last examination in 2019, there was a number of recommendations, most importantly that the rights for women in Northern Ireland need to put on an equal footing with rights for women in England, Scotland and Wales, and obviously very little has happened, and that's just one of the impacts of we having no executive for 2 years. And that's something we do in the sector. We try and build capacity for organizations to use those provisions to advocate for rights, because something that we have raised at UN level and global level is that gender equality still has very low priority in Northern Ireland on the whole, and that has been discussed at length in different ways today, and Elaine has set out a lot of the issues, so I'll not go into that. The one thing I would say is that all of the international human rights standards understand gender inequalities as a structural issue. You know, it's not just an individual issue. Some women have better opportunities, others don't have. So we need those structures, policies, and laws to support that. And that's basically what we advocate for. And I think, you know, the example of Finland was mentioned earlier on issues, and I am Finnish. There are not many of us, but we are here. And what I would say is that the evidence, Finland's one example, but at UN level, but good practice shows that countries that have achieved better standards understand that structural side of things. And that's basically what we are working for at a local level. So we need to understand what the structural issues are. We need to have a gender lens in all policy making. Gender budgeting is one tool that can be used for that, and there's lots of people in the room with much more expertise than me on all of that. And then gender parity in decision making. And it was really encouraging to hear the First Minister and Deputy First Minister talk about that, because that's one of the things that, for example, is core to UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which is one area that we work on. Basically, it's about women at all tables, at all times, which is, as we know, not happening at this stage. And as I say, we're a policy-based level organization. I don't get out half as much as I would like to, and I think it's really important to say that grassroots women's voices need to be heard directly at all levels. But just to finish off, we did, a few years ago, I actually worked with Kelly on a piece of work on marking the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, marking 20 years. And we asked women, you know, what would Northern Ireland look like if it worked for women? And they talked about all the issues that have already been mentioned, but they all talked about they feel sidelined and not heard. And I think it's interesting and important, and it's reflected in the research on Brexit, because I think in the conversations we had with women, it was very difficult for women to disentangle Brexit from the wider situation that's been here, and the sort of overall sense of insecurity that's actually leading to mistrust. So really, you know, to go forward, what we need is stronger voices for women at all levels. We do need adequate funding for the sector and for services that support women. Very importantly as well, we need to implement the rights that are there and make sure that they don't backslide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jona. Now, Kelly Turtle is Head of Policy and Engagement at Age NI, which is working to make sure that the voices of older people are heard and that their rights are protected as well. Kelly has also worked in human rights education at the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. So please welcome Kelly Turtle.
Thank you. I used to get invited to do panels when I was a wee young feminist in my 20s doing grassroots feminist activism. I used to get asked to be the young woman on the panel, and that doesn't happen anymore, which is great. And now I'm in a role where I'm advocating on behalf of older people. I'm delighted to be able to bring some of the issues that we hear about that are of concern to older women into this space today. It's interesting for me, having been involved in lots of feminist work and having been a women's sector lobbyist. I've worked on so many issues over the years that do tend to focus on women in this sort of like at working age and when we're kind of in our reproductive years, whether it's reproductive rights and healthcare or childcare. And that often I think older women's issues can get left off the agenda a little bit. There's plenty of older women in the room because I love that we have an intergenerational movement, particularly in Reclaim the Agenda incredibly intergenerational movement, but we need to really be looking for the issues that impact older women. And it starts with a lack of understanding of ageism, I think, even within our own communities and even within ourselves sometimes. Can we as women really embrace ageing for the wonderful thing that it is? How many times have you maybe said to an older woman, or had it said to you, when they tell you their age, you say, gosh, you don't look your age, as if that's a compliment. And it just sort of highlights all of those biases and things that we have within ourselves. Ageism and sexism so often go hand in hand when it comes to discrimination, and we've seen that in some high-profile discrimination cases. So we want to start by embracing ageing for the positive thing that it is, because the harm that's caused when we don't do that is invisibility. And we know from research across the UK that older women feel much more invisible than older men. So there is a gendered impact there. We see the legislative impact of that invisibility within our own discrimination law here in Northern Ireland. We still don't have age discrimination that protects people when they're accessing goods, facilities and services. So ageism is definitely not just alive and well culturally, but it is a gap within our own legislative arena. So some of the issues that are of high importance to the older women that we've engaged with recently, particularly through our lived experience survey, where we don't necessarily break the data down by gender, but we know that health is a priority issue for older people in Northern Ireland. And what that means for women is that women have shorter, healthy life expectancy. This is coming from government official data. Men do have longer life expectancy than women, but women spend a greater proportion of our lives in ill health. And so we need to really look at how women have access to health services. There's great enthusiasm and momentum around a women's health strategy for Northern Ireland. There's been similar work taking place in GB in recent years on that, but it must include the needs of older women. And I have to say, it was great to see the MLAs. I think it might have been the very first day they were back up on the Hill. They were meeting to talk about the women's health strategy, and they were putting on their menopause vests. Do you remember that? It was one of the first things they did. Robin Swan, experiencing what a hot flush feels like. So, you know, let's carry on in that direction. Let's make sure that older women's needs are central to the development of a women's health strategy. Some recent research by Age UK, our partner organisation, shows there are statistically significant differences in health needs for older women and older men, particularly post-pandemic. So women are reporting much higher incidence of anxiety and depression, of physical pain, feeling that they're just not as independent as they were before the pandemic, feeling that their general health is lower. So far higher percentage of older women reporting that than older men. And older women generally feel they just don't have any faith in the healthcare system. So for women to go their whole lives kind of taking care of everybody else, making sure their children get, you know, to the GP whenever they need it, taking on those family caring roles, to get to our later years and find that we just don't have confidence that the health and social care system will be able to meet our needs. That is something that we really need to be fixing. So care has already been mentioned numerous times over the course of today. I was going to highlight the great research that Siobhan mentioned earlier on that's recently been launched around the impact of caring on women. And I just want to note from that research that what it tells us is that it sets patterns early in life that impact us in later life. So the number one risk factor for poverty in retirement is gender. Single women are the group that are most likely to live in poverty in retirement. And when you take into consideration the gendered roles that we've had all throughout our lives, that's how we get to that point. That doesn't just happen by accident. So we need to really deal with the care system that's in place and how care is viewed and valued in society. And just to finish off, I'll mention the issue of sandwich care, because we do talk a lot about childcare in the women's sector, and we don't always talk about the other types of care that women are overrepresented in providing. We know there's this issue of sandwich care where you could be caring for your children and an older or ill or disabled relative at the same time. The age bracket of that sandwich care is growing, the upper age limit is getting higher and higher as people are not just caring for their children and their parents, but they're caring for their grandchildren. And in some cases, we're hearing about people caring for great-grandchildren as well. So unless we fix all the parts of the care system, women will continue to carry the burden of that broken system. So I just want to finish by saying, I echo what's been said on the stage about we need to be tackling these as structural issues completely. That's throughout my whole career as a feminist and as a women's advocate, I've always taken that approach. And the future of the women's movement here and the movement for equality needs to be intersectional. When we look at the gains made, there is going to be a backlash, and we're already seeing that backlash. And the first tactic of the backlash will be divide and conquer. And we cannot let that happen. We all have to stand together. Trans women, black minority, ethnic women, migrant women, we have to be fighting for each other, and we have to have older women as a really important part of that intersectional approach.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, we have speakers here from different echelons of society, different experience and expertise. So we're going to open this to the floor, ladies and gentlemen. We have a couple of roving microphones again. If you would like to ask questions, put your hands up. Just at the back there, we have a couple to start off with. Thank you very much for your question. Is it to one person or a general question?
It's to everybody, please. Hi, my name is Charmaine Jones and I work for Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network. So I work with all these wonderful ladies every day of my life. So I'm just going to pose a question to all four of them, which is, today we're really reflecting on the progress that's been made to advance equality over the last 25 years, but what changes would you like to see in our society for the next 25 years?
There's a tall order. Your wish list. Elaine, do you want to start off with? Keep it brief.
I'll be as brief as I can. And hello, Charmaine. There's so many, it's really hard to know where to start. So the first thing I would say is just the big thing that would unlock everything else is starting to look at the problems that we face in a society, not as a problem to do with an individual person that they can overcome if they just work hard enough and if they're lucky enough, but a problem to do with how we set things up, the structures of things. It's kind of like what Kelly was saying. Every problem really, it's about structural issues, not anything else. But we need to start framing it that way. I mean, we do it in our work, but we need society as a whole to start seeing it that way. It's not, an individual's fault that they can't get back into education because, after the age of 16 or 17, they've had a baby, they're at home, they're going to be on benefits forever. That's their choice because somebody else did well. That's not it at all. It's the structures of things, that they don't have childcare available, that there's no support there for them, and that things would be different if we put those things in place. So if we could start looking at what are structural problems as structural problems, instead of as she doesn't have enough mettle, she doesn't have enough get up and go, she's just not working hard enough. I think that would unlock everything else. So that's my one.
Kelly, what about you?
Yeah, I would echo the structural thing. I think it maybe goes even further back than that. We actually need a society that recognises that women are not equal, that we do not have gender equality, because quite often that's the basis I have to start a discussion if we're trying to create change on whatever the issue is. You're having to persuade people that actually, you know what, we might have all this lovely legislation, but in reality we live in a very patriarchal society here that is coded for the way men live their lives. I don't think that was designed to exclude women, but it certainly needs shifting to include women and the lives that they live, all that sandwich caring and these are the lives that we live. We need to recognise that those inequalities exist and start from there as a starting point, and then, as Elaine said, absolutely, this less of the finger pointing that, if you were just womaning a bit better, you wouldn't have these problems.
And Louise, is there a particular problem in rural areas from your experience and the experience of your members? That patriarchal society that you talked about?
Yeah, I uphold women's choice to live their lives the way they want to live them. And quite often women will choose a caring role. That's what they want to be doing. They'd like to be resourced and recognised and visible and valued for all of that. But that might still be their choice, but quite often in rural areas it's not a choice. It is very much culturally embedded in rural areas that it will be the woman in the family who will provide the caring. It will be them, you know, it'll be the eldest daughter who will have to go part-time because their mommy or daddy needs looked after. That quite often isn't even a discussion. That's how embedded it is. You know, it is absolutely just an assumption, and also a deeply embedded assumption even in women to not question it. You know, so we have a ways to go.
Yona, what's on your wish list as we look forward?
Yeah, I think it has already been said in this panel and earlier what changes are needed. I would just add that a lot of the basic provisions already exist there in international human rights standards. If they could be incorporated meaningfully in our local policies. And just to add, Kelly talked about intersectionality. You know, I think one thing we need to also understand that is as part of the structures that we need to put in place, it's not the same level, so it's not one size fits all. So migrant women, for example, may need additional support or different support than other people, and it's not about it's not about giving anybody an extra leg up. It's just making sure that the stool everybody stands on eventually is the same.
So Kelly, if we're standing in 2049 and we're looking back, what would you like to have seen to be achieved in that time?
I think we would absolutely need to have been focusing on our rapidly ageing society, because not even by 2049, by 2028, there's going to be more people over 65 in Northern Ireland than there are under 15. So, and we're aging at a rate that's quicker than the rest of the UK. So a lot of these problems we've identified today with care and with the care system and the role that then women have to take on is because we haven't as a society prepared for an ageing society, and reform of adult social care has just been left on the back burner for so many years. Those are the things that if we can fix those, we'll be looking at a much different sort of future, and it's the key that Elaine said that will unlock so many of the gender equality issues.
Anyone else? Question? I have a person right at the back. Yes, go ahead. Wait until you get the microphone if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Hiya. It's sort of a general question.
Just put your mic really close to you if you don't mind. Thank
Sorry.
you. That's great.
It's a general question for the panel, and it's in regards to sex-based language and the material reality of biological sex when we talk about inequality for women. I don't know if anyone's familiar with a court case that's coming up in Employment Tribunal of a woman who spoke about the importance of biological sex in a rape crisis centre as being relevant to women who receive care there. And she was de facto suspended by her employer. And what I want to ask is there any scope for Section 75, for example, for women with beliefs in biological reality, in being female? Is there any scope for our legislation to incorporate those beliefs given cases like Maya Forstater, for example, in the UK?
Okay, I'll ask Elaine maybe to take that.
Yeah, I wouldn't dream of speaking about an ongoing case anywhere.
Yeah, no.
But what I would say is we don't have a rape crisis centre in Northern Ireland. We have a rape crisis service. It isn't a physical building that people can just walk into off the street, and I think it's really important people know that and understand that. There's a phone line, and that phone line is answered on certain days of the week during certain hours.
Which
and
was threatened with a cut in its budget there.
Absolutely, and then they set up individual one-on-one kind of counselling for those people who've called in. But there isn't a chance that you could walk into a room and meet somebody you don't expect to meet. We don't have that here. And I want to emphasise this, and I think the rest of the question I'll leave. But the particular issue of, we don't have the same provision as other places on this island do, and as the island across the water when it comes to these kind of things. If a person has experienced sexual violence and needs a physical examination, they are sent to the Rowan, which is attached to the Antrim Area Hospital, leaving aside that it's not super accessible for people down in the southwest, for example. Speaking of being rural and from the middle of nowhere, if you're from rural Fermanagh and you're in an abusive relationship and you need to get to a rape crisis centre and it's in the Antrim Area Hospital, how are you going to do that without being noticed? You're not. But we don't have the same kind of services as elsewhere. And I would really like if we could start with that. And I would really like if we had a focus more on providing the needs that women have. And by women, I mean all women, and I include transgender women, I include all of the other minoritized women, and just women in general. There is so much need, there's so much we have to do, and I think that should come first.
Okay, our ladies and gentlemen, please thank our speakers on our panel today, Elaine Crory, Louise Coyle, Fiona Monaghan and Kelly Turtle. Thank you very much for your input. And thank you. And we're going to move on to the next part of our conference now. And it's called Women in Politics. The first woman was elected to Parliament in Westminster in 1918, Constance Markievicz. But since then, that was 1918, remember, the number of women politicians, that has not matched the percentage of women in our population, particularly in Northern Ireland, in the Assembly and in the councils. So for this part, we're going to focus on women in politics. And before we hear from our panel, as I'd like actually our panel, if they could make their way to the seats, let's hear from Brona Hines. You'll all know Brona, but if you don't, let me introduce her as a women's rights advocate, former Deputy Chief Commissioner for the Equality Commission, and Brona, a member of the Women's Coalition and a negotiator of the Good Friday Agreement. Let's hear from Brona Hines, who unfortunately can't be with us in person here at the conference, but she has sent this message on video.
We have seen a significant change in women in politics in Northern Ireland over the last 25 years. From around 10% in the first assembly to 37% today. But we still lag well behind Scotland and Wales. And despite great initiatives like women in local councils, women are still just 26% of councillors. Our political parties need to monitor and address the choke points that are preventing greater equality and diversity in their representation. The increase of women's representation in public appointments to over 40% is good to see, but the predominance of women in certain appointments, such as health and education, and not in other areas, reveals that we still have stubborn challenges to address to increase diversity across public appointments and to increase the number of women as chairs of public bodies. Put simply, women are more than 50% of our society. It is important that women are seen to be represented and feel that they are represented. Their participation in political and public life adds a broader range of perspectives, and this enhances the ability to address the concerns of a wider range of stakeholders. And if we can crack the nut of ensuring that women are fully and equally represented at 50% across all institutions, public bodies, and in society, we can surely take lessons from that to increase diversity across all of our other areas in society.
There you go. Our thanks to Brona Hines for sending us that message. First, let's hear from our panel, and Dr. Kiva Archibald is the Minister for Finance at the Assembly. She was first elected as an MLA for Sinn Féin in 2016 and re-elected in 2017 and 22. Please welcome the Minister, Kiva Archibald. Do you want to say a few words first, Kiva? Oh, well, if you want to sit there. Is it on?
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So I was asked just to say a few words of background about myself.
Just as an introduction, and then we'll quiz you later.
So I've been elected to the Assembly since 2016, and then was re-elected in 2017 and 2022. Before I got into politics, I was a research scientist. I worked in horticulture and plant pathology and research for about 10 years.
Go ahead, keep going.
And
there we go.
And I suppose people often ask me about how that pathway happened. Well, I've always had an interest in politics, and I suppose from my family perspective, there would have always been politics discussed and on the news, and it was always from a perspective of equality and social justice rather from a party politics. element in respect of that. But my dad was a councillor elected in 2011 in Coleraine Borough Council, and I kind of worked alongside him in terms of supporting his constituency work. And you see so much of what people experience in their everyday lives. And that really opened my eyes, I suppose, in some respects to what people are dealing with. And just as things progressed in 2015, I was asked to consider running for the Westminster election. At the time, I was research contract was beginning to come to an end. I had the opportunity of another one coming up, but I considered my options at the time, and I thought that's something that you don't get asked to do very often. It's not an opportunity that comes along more than once for most people, I'm sure. And I decided at that point to throw my lot in and run for election. I didn't get elected in 2016, but I used it then to gain some experience and ran again in the Assembly election in 2016, and I was successfully elected. I think the reason I chose to, at that point, get into politics in an elected sense was, you have an opportunity to make a difference to people's lives, and that was something that really motivated me. During my time in the Assembly, I have worked on the ERA Committee, the Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee. I chaired it in the period between 2016 and 2017. And then in the last Assembly term, I chaired the Economy Committee. There were roles that I really embraced and enjoyed. And you do have, I think, particularly in the last mandate when we were working our way through COVID, there was an awful lot of interaction with people who were going through really, really difficult times and really difficult circumstances. I think as an Assembly, we came together at that time and did our best to make a difference to people and to try and help people and support people through what was a really, really challenging time. So this Assembly mandate just a month ago passed there. On Saturday, I was appointed as Minister for Finance, which is a role that I am so far really enjoying. It's a very, very challenging role, and I'm sure most people know the difficulties facing us from a financial and budgetary perspective, and I'm really looking forward to the challenge over the months ahead as I'm working with everybody else in the Executive and in the Assembly to try and do our best for people.
Okay, thank you, Kiva. I'm going to introduce you next, sitting beside Kate Nicholl. Kate was the 79th Lord Mayor of Belfast before she was elected to the Assembly, and she is the Alliance Party's spokesperson for early years and childcare and the chair of the all-party group on ethnic minorities. How did you get into politics, Kate?
Working for Anna Lohr. I grew up in Zimbabwe and I moved here when I was 12. And always felt like an outsider and couldn't wait to leave. So when I finished school, I went to university in London. And every time I came back to visit my mum, I just felt this sense of relief. And I realized that this was where I was meant to live. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I had applied for a law conversion because my undergrad had been in anthropology, which is really interesting, but not at all vocational. And I was working in a restaurant. And Anna was just... She was just class. She was the first person I ever voted for. She was kind of pro-choice. She talked about environmental issues. She talked about minority ethnic community rights, and she wore a leather jacket. And I just thought she was so cool. So I wrote to her and asked if I could do some work experience. And then I just kept going into her office as a volunteer. I started working in the restaurant at night time, going into the constituency office every single day, and then eventually a job opened up, and I think she knew she just had to give it to me. So I started working for her as a researcher, and then she retired, and actually shamefully the only minority ethnic MLA ever to be elected to the Assembly, and poor Lillian has to carry all the work that people like Anna had done before, and we really need to deal with representation because it's shameful that we're completely white Assembly, and shameful that I'm the chair of the all-party group on minority ethnic communities, a white African. You don't get more privilege than that. So we're trying to address that. I then worked in marketing for a while, became a councillor in Belfast City Council, had the chance to be Lord Mayor of Belfast, which I took, and I loved it. And then heavily pregnant, I ran for the assembly, not thinking I was getting elected, thought I was going to get a year maternity leave. I got no maternity leave and I got elected, but was delighted. And I've been an MLA for the past 2 years, but only a real one for the past month. So delighted to get stuck in.
Thank you, Kate. Now, beside you is Lillian Sinoy Barr, who was elected to Derry City and Strabane District Council for the SDLP. And she broke new ground by becoming the first black person to be selected for public office here and the first black councillor in Northern Ireland. So who inspired you to become a politician?
Oh,
keep the microphone up tight, and we'll get you.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, inspired me to come into politics. Probably my mother, really, because I've seen a lot of women go through politics in Kenya, particularly. And before I got into politics, I was an activist. I started activism when I was 12 years of age, when I went to my secondary school, and I used to be the only Maasai girl. For anybody who knows the story of the Maasai people, is that women, their place is the kitchen, and everybody else, men, are the ones who run everything in society. So I'm very privileged to come from a very loving family. And my father is actually the biggest feminist. And I have 8 brothers who are also feminist. And they made sure that the 6 sisters were never left behind. So I grew up in a family that we were all equal. And thanks to my mother for making sure that happened, because she wasn't educated like my father. My father was a doctor. My mom was not educated. But she made sure that her place was not a kitchen. And she was a businesswoman. And I grew up seeing how she was leading our family, how she was navigating really complex society issues. And really, when I came here to Northern Ireland and looked at the challenges that minoritized women are facing, not being able to access any services, not having the visibility that they should have, and not having a voice in all aspects of public life, I thought, you know what? I think I can do it. I'm a woman, I'm capable, and I need to do it. So I just looked at what my mother did, and I thought I can be in any platform that I wish to be, because that's what my mother told me I can. So she was the one who inspired me to get into politics.
Lovely to hear that. We have Lindsay McLaren, who's a councillor in Ars and North Down Borough Council, representing the Ulster Unionist Party. Now, she is one of many politicians, and we mentioned this earlier, women politicians in particular, who've been subjected to threatening and abusive rubbish on social media. So Lindsay's going to say a few words before we open it up to the floor. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you, Donna. Sorry, I just needed something to lean on, actually. It's
That's
easier
okay.
to talk. If you don't mind, well, I'll be as quick as I can. So, yeah, Lindsay McLaren, and it's really fantastic to be here today. The irony is not lost on me that I'm addressing a room of incredibly strong, independent women who are able to juggle a career against adversity, and yet my morning included my 4-year-old son, who was up all night with a sore ear, my daughter, who has a cast from hip to toe after dislocating her knee and who absolutely refused to go on public transport to get to school, because what sort of mother are you? And prior to entering the room this afternoon, I walked into the bathroom, looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge, changed my clothes, kicked off my trainers, put on some makeup, and voila, I am a politician. And I think this reminds me that we are not simply strong, independent women, and sometimes we actually don't have a choice but to just get up and get it done. If we drop the ball, who picks it up? Childcare and motherhood in particular have dictated my career both in the police and politics. I'll give you a small example. Whenever I was in the police, I was in a unit, it was called TSG, which is Tactical Support Group. I was the only female in my unit, and if you imagine sort of riots on the 12th of July, and I have my helmet on, and it's 4 or 5 stone worth of uniform on. And when you've got that on, they don't know that you're a female. And I remember one time a guy walked past me on a Saturday night and he went, "Right, big lad." So it was a very glamorous career. But I also remember one afternoon there was a spontaneous riot somewhere. I can't even remember where it was. And I remember looking down at my then husband, who was also in TSG, also getting petrol bombs and bricks thrown at him. And suddenly I realised, what about the children? So I said to the guys on the left and right of me, "Right, quick guys, can you cover me?" And they put shields over the top of me and they went, "Lindsay, are you hurt?" I says, "No, I have to phone the childminder." And I was standing there with petrol bombs being hit off my helmet, saying to the childminder, "I'm going to be late this evening." And she said, "That sounds very noisy where you are, and is everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything's fine." And that's just the way it was. The childcare especially just always fell to me. I was then a firearms instructor, which shows probably how far we have came, considering whenever Judith first joined, women didn't even have a gun, and then I was actually teaching people how to shoot them. It's a much more boring job than what it sounds. It sounds very cool, but it absolutely was not. So I am a single mum of 4. My eldest is 25. I have twins who are 14. And at 43, ended up with another one who is now, his 4th birthday is today. I am absolutely exhausted. And if there are any single mums out here today, you know you will literally do anything to get out of the house. So I joined politics. And the reason I did so, I was on the school runs and I was listening to a very famous and controversial gentleman on in the morning. And I remember becoming angry about injustice and social inequality. And I've seen firsthand how division has destroyed Northern Ireland in the past, and it's dictated so much of our life here. And yet, to me, there is so much more to Northern Ireland than the awful green and orange debate. Unfortunately, throughout my life, I did suffer a few experiences which were reflective of how poor and neglected our services had become. And I wanted to ensure that women didn't suffer the same as I had, and this is, I promise I'm not, this is not to start getting morbid or anything, it's just to let you know, and I know that I'm not going to be the only woman here who has experienced similar trauma. So my first child, unfortunately, was a cot death, and I remember, sorry, and I remember getting, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Here, have a wee drink of water.
Thank you. I remember I got handed a bottle of temazepam, and that was the extent of the care that I received. And thankfully, I had an incredibly strong mother and 3 very strong sisters. And my mum took the bottle out of my hand and she said, you know, take a few weeks off. And I was marched back to university. And I'm really grateful that she done that. As I said, I have 3 sisters, and again, just to show you how supportive or not women can be, I had a picture in the paper recently, and I was standing beside the most incredible man. I won't say who it was, but he was an amazing man, and you all will know who it is. And I sent a picture to my family WhatsApp group, and I said, "Wow, look where my life has look where I've ended up." And the first response was, "Lindsay, you need to be careful of your blusher application." And that was the extent of support and the well done that I got from my sisters. But the reason I talk about my previous experiences was that it would have been absurd 25 years ago for women like Kiva and Kate to be standing up in the executive talking about women's health strategies. They were simply women's problems. And now menopause and perinatal women's health are now front and centre, and we're now talking about strategies to bring Northern Ireland kicking and screaming in line with our English counterparts. Childcare strategies, we've talked about that over and over today, and mental health strategies. So lastly, just before I finish, sorry, I know I'm taking up a lot of your time. Politics, and the reason I'm standing here today, I got an invitation a few days ago and I'm very grateful, and it was in response to a radio show that I had done, which was reflective of the abuse I have received. So I got elected back in May. Within 2 days of being elected, I received a letter to my home address, and as a previous police officer, I was very careful not to divulge my address. So how they got that, I don't know. And the letter stated how I had used my children's death as a vehicle to get votes. Yeah, so I mean that was horrific. I continually get abuse about what I'm wearing, what I look like, if I want to go on a date. I'm sure it has happened to the girls here. You make a friend on Facebook thinking they're a genuine political activist or supporter, and you get a message asking, are you single? So I am working with the Joe Cox Foundation in conjunction with the John and Pat Hume Foundation in a couple of weeks to talk, ironically, about respectful political discourse. And I was sitting there at the table earlier and I thought to myself, I got a threat then last week because I had the audacity to talk about what I perceived to be an injustice online. I won't even tell you what it was about, but and I was threatened, and I was told that I needed to watch myself at night. Now I'm a single mum. I live alone with my children, and it's a horrible prospect, thinking that all it takes is one lunatic to arrive at your door. And when I was sitting there earlier on, I thought, I wonder how many times Joe Cox MP sat at conferences exactly like this, talking about women in politics and what needs to change. So I fully intend, with the rest of my career, to hopefully progress women in politics to be not just an exception, but absolutely the norm. And thank you for allowing me to take up so much of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Lindsay, for sharing that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, questions from the floor there. And we have a couple of roving microphones. Put your hand up. Yes, in the middle. Sorry, in the middle if you've got a microphone there. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Eleanor Jordan and I work at Windsor Women's Centre in the village. And Lindsay, it's an active UVF, UFF, LVF paramilitary area, as you know. I've worked there 34 years, and the phrase that used to freak me out, because I had 2 wee children when I started, was, "We know where you live." That's all I had to say, as I might have scratched the car. I've always had no cars, you all know. But you know, we just have to live with this, work through it, rise above it, not be afraid. Once you're afraid, they see your fear. And I've never worked with them as Windsor Women's Centre, nor will we. And I'm very proud of that fact that we're a distinct professional organisation. But my question, It's been an amazing day for me, you know, and learning so much more. We can get very into silos, you know, in our areas, in whatever, you know, paramilitaries are running them, whatever. But my question is today that I'd like you to take away, if you don't have an answer. Great to hear so much about the childcare strategy. Long needed, everybody's supporting it. My worry is, first of all, we don't call our childcare workers now. We call them child development workers, to move away from that. It's a bit like babysitting. So who's talking about who's going to deliver all these extra hours? My worry is it's moving much more towards private daycare. And what about organisations like us and many, many others in the women's sector who provide respite, children of parents and women experiencing violence or whatever, and those children don't have an equal playing field. You're talking about equality, and if you don't have early intervention, and I would like to see something around being linked into the childcare strategy, that child development worker jobs would be provided to deliver those hours to women who mightn't want to work the 30 hours if those jobs are out there, might want to retrain, might want to just do what we call pre-employment courses, or may just want to do parenting and personal development. So I would like that as a sort of conjunction added into the child care strategy, because honestly we've heard about it how many years, hard to believe it's actually happening, but how does it relate to an area of disadvantage of children? And I'm proud to say, you know, our organisation represents women from 41 countries. Not too many people can say that. There's so much work to do. Imagine the child development workers trying to work with children with so many languages, cultural, whatever, and everybody's doing it who's providing daycare. So if there's some way they could be linked, I think you're missing an opportunity not to add that in.
Or even
when
for that
you talk.
childcare strategy to be implemented for women like yourself and others, maybe one of those ethnically diverse communities in the village, to enter politics, so
Well,
that they
that
have,
could be
so
another
that they
course.
have
We've
the
always done
facilities
women
that
in
they can do
politics
so.
and stuff. It's giving people the opportunity,
The opportunity.
to take part if they choose. We're talking, I'm sitting with a friend I've made from the Falls now. I mean, the beauty of focus groups. And people say what you think, and the ones that give the women 20 quid are the better ones.
Okay.
They
Kiva,
shouldn't,
do you wanna-
they shouldn't be expected to give their time, their views, their opinions for free. Why should they?
Well, thank you.
I think I'll stop.
Your input is very much appreciated. Let's focus and hone down on that childcare. And even in relation to, as I said, for women like yourselves who have children who want to get involved in politics, but there's no childcare strategy there or implementation that's available to them.
Yeah, and just before I respond to that, I just want to give my solidarity to Lindsay. Nobody should face threats and abuse in the way that she has in the past short while. In response to the question on the childcare strategy, the childcare strategy is being developed longer than I've been in the Assembly, and I've been there since 2016, so it is a piece of work that really needs to progress. And I think you make a really important point. The workers need to be properly valued and recompensed for the really important work that they do, and it is about child development, not just about childminding. And I think I speak for many of us involved in the work on it, in saying that we do very much have that perspective on it. And I think it is important, therefore, that it's co-designed. And I know that's a buzzword, but I do think it is really important that we listen to the views and perspectives of people actually delivering it, because it is going to be a real challenge in terms of having a workforce strategy that lives up to the expectations and the demands that there is going to be. And as you know, in relation to women in politics, women like Kate and my colleagues, Liz and Gemma, who have had babies while they are in the Assembly, there is no maternity for MLAs or councillors, and it makes it very difficult. And I think one of the important things that we did see during COVID, and which is unfortunately lapsing in council currently, it was the hybrid working arrangements, which were really important in supporting not just women, but people with caring responsibilities or other responsibilities. And we don't have that currently in the Assembly, and I think, again, it's something that needs to be looked at, because it did provide that wee bit more flexibility than what there had been previously, because you can be in there till 9, 10 at night, midnight, 1 in the morning, and waiting to vote on something. But if you're able to do that via proxy voting and you're able to contribute online, it does give you that little bit more flexibility.
Kate, from your experience, and I know you had your party conference and little ones and all around, but also we had one of the MLAs had her baby on the first day, brought her baby in with her. The difficulties for you in regard to childcare and being a politician, or not even childcare, just family care, and being a politician and being a professional politician, having it as a career.
Yeah, I mean, the systems are not designed for women at all. My colleague, Sharon Mulholland, has a 9-week-old baby. She's a new MLA. And I actually feel sick, that she was in committee last week holding her baby. And she's fine, and she's up for it. But I think of my own child and how we just had the election, and there was a chance of a snap election. I was new. I was so excited to be in the role. I wanted to start doing things on childcare. And I agree, Eleanor, it should not be free hours is not the way, because it's about parental employment. Child development is directly investing in the provider, which is private. It's sort of voluntary and community. It's childminders. So there is a better model, which we've been working on. And the money should follow the child. But it's just wrong, And when I think back to having Etain, and even though the Assembly wasn't running, I was in the constituency office every day. I was having policy meetings. This baby came everywhere with me. And I was so lucky I could have her with me. But I regret it, I feel sad that I didn't have that focused maternity leave with my child. And I think what is happening at the moment with the end of hybrid meetings, Lillian just whispered to me, we need to fight it. We absolutely have to fight it. The end of hybrid meetings within councils is a disaster, because for so many women, being a councillor is your way of being involved in politics, but because it's part-time, you're able to do other things. But those evening meetings, I mean, I'm solo parenting this week, and Lindsay, I just think you're amazing, by the way. That speech was extraordinary, and you've been so generous and honest and had an awful couple of weeks. But childcare, committee meetings at nighttime, all these things are so hard to balance. So we have to put flexible working in place. We have to have hybrid. And it's not just for people with caring responsibilities, it's accessibility, all sorts of things as well. We live in a new world, and politics needs to move with that.
And talking about a new world, Lillian, we now live in a Northern Ireland that is more culturally and ethnically diverse. How would you encourage a woman from an ethnic minority to get involved in politics?
I think the first thing we have to remember that the challenges of leadership cannot be compared with the impact that you can have. So any woman here, regardless of your background, who wants to get into politics, please do. Just look at what is happening right now when we have women in leadership positions. I don't remember, I'm here 14 years, by the way, so I'm looking at this from the outside in. When I came here, I could hardly hear stories of women being shared in Stormont. Yes, women were speaking by themselves, but now we hear men talking about menopause, and we hear men talking about childcare. They didn't just switch off their brains and say, oh yeah, we start caring about women. It's because of women being on the table. So if you really care about any issues being tackled, whether they are gender issues, whether they are racial issues, you absolutely have to be there. And I have to commend the Equality Commission because of the issues of ethnic monitoring. And I'm also delighted that we have a minister here, because I would be asking you to allocate £122,000 to ethnic monitoring. It's a budget that is already there, and I'm looking forward to working with you on that. And by the way, she's my friend, so I think she won't let me down. So
if you don't ask, you don't get. Well done, Lillian. Good opportunity there.
and when we're talking about gender, we're talking about childcare issues. I think if we start looking at all issues through a gender lens, using gender principles, we're not going to get anything wrong. I spent quite a lot of time before I came here in Kenya working with a lot of women who got into politics. And one of the best achievements that women had in Kenya is to change the whole constitution. In 2010, Kenya brought in something called Gender Principle Act. And what that means is it creates quotas of women. So we can say that we have women challenges. We are facing a lot of challenges. We can get into politics. The gender quotas take into consideration that of that. You get childcare, you get caring responsibilities, you get a lot of support, because every policy that is developed is looked through a gender lens. So I'll also be coming next about gender budgeting. That is so important that we absolutely ensure that every single department develop their policies through gender lens. So my friend, stay there for the 3 years and we can work together to deliver for women.
Thank you, Lynn. Anybody else from the floor? Yes. Hello, thank you for your question.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was just thinking in my sector, I'm in a very male-dominated sector in IT, and it's what you're talking about happens us as well, you know, the late meetings, and there's one time, you know, I couldn't take up training and development because of childcare. You know, you can't progress in your career because of all different reasons. But recently, it's just, I'd like to know, you know, if you're going for new jobs now, you know, you have to be hybrid, or, you know, I live in rural Northern Ireland, so that puts me off completely, you know. And I'm sort of thinking, you know, do you ever talk to companies, or do you talk to, you know, companies who are looking at the hybrid model or fully remote? It might work for rural people more, because if we have to do hybrid working, it's always travelling to Belfast, and it's always getting the bus up, and it's all affecting the family as well. So if you're doing that up in Stormont, you know, you have to do late meetings and things like that. That's actually happening on the ground as well, and probably in every sector, you know, there's shift working. That's just the way it is. Or if you say, listen, I could do this fully remote, I could do this training fully remote, but no, you have to be present. What's the argument? But do you think that you could do your job remotely, and if you do it remotely, perhaps that could filter down to us?
So it's leading by example, is that what you're saying? So if we see the hybrid working amongst the politicians up at the Assembly, you're hoping, well, we heard from the Employers Federation, and different organisations, of course, have their own strategies, but that's an example or an influence, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, if that's what you want to suit your families, is that something that we could put into law or something? You know, I don't know.
It's leading by example, Kiva, is it not?
Yeah, and I think there is a legislative piece as well, and I know that they have done some stuff around it in the south in relation to flexible working, and it is something that we're looking at, because it would give employees rights to request flexible working, hybrid or remote could be part of that. But it is something that obviously will take a wee bit of quality development. But I think it's a culture shift too for many organisations. You know, this is the way they always did things. COVID came along and it did shift things at quite a significant pace. But in some respects, things have slipped back to a wee bit as well. So I think there are conversations that need to be had kind of societally and you know, with business representatives and others. And some people will have different perspectives on it, and I know they do. But I think that it does have to be about taking into account that bigger picture, and about how we try to get more people into work. And we hear all the time about how, you know, we're nearly at full employment. Well, we have to give people pathways in, and we have to remove the barriers that exist, and that, as you have laid out, is one of them.
And as you said, Lillian, if we look at everything through the gender lens, it'll be a little bit more enlightening. Anyone else from the... Let me see. Down there, Mal?
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring to listen to all of you chat. And Kate, you had said, you know, the system's not built for women, and it's not built for marginalised voices either, including, the LGBTQ community, Black and ethnic minorities. So my question to kind of everybody, how do you cope whenever you have that voice in your head saying that this system's not built for you, that you shouldn't be speaking up for this, and like hearing all of the other people saying, you shouldn't be in this room, you shouldn't be a part of this conversation? How do you cope with that? Because it's hard, So yes, thank you so much.
Lindsay, do you want to take that on? Because you did mention about the abuse that you have received, but in general, even someone questioning, single mother, what are you doing in politics and getting involved in such a way?
Yeah. I have to admit, and I hate admitting this, that for the first time in the last couple of weeks, I genuinely questioned my career choice. My family, my dad was nearly in tears, thinking that I'm sitting on my own, and that someone has threatened my personal security and subsequently that of my children. They feel very helpless. As I said earlier, I have 3 daughters, and I've brought them all up to be, raving feminists. However, disappointingly, I thought they were going to be, Mummy, you really need to see this through. You really need to prove that, that those threats and that abuse isn't going to stop you doing what you know you should be doing, which is a public representative for all the people in my constituency. However, they unfortunately want me to step back. There is I feel personally a huge burden of responsibility. As a woman in this role, considering I'm in the lower tier of things, so I've entered politics as a councillor. And I wonder, does anyone know here, for example, talking about barriers to politics for women? I get 900, I'm sorry, this is a safe space, I'm assuming, so I just have to be very, very honest. £950 a month to be a councillor. In order to do my job, I must send my son to a childminder, because it wouldn't be the first Zoom meeting I've had where Hugo has been dressed as a Power Ranger in the background shouting, "Go, go, Power Rangers," and I'm trying to be all professional. And taking out childcare and the amount of money it costs for me to drive all around the constituency to go to meetings, I'm on £2.97 an hour for the privilege of representing my constituency. And when women say to me, "I would love to go into politics, would you recommend it?" Part of me says no. But equally, on the other hand, if we don't change it, who's going to? And everyone in this room, I think we've all got a very similar theme in that we haven't got where we are without an incredibly lonely journey. And Elaine, I think, had mentioned earlier, how many times has someone reached out a hand and actually helped you up and give you support? And it hasn't been that often. I've actually forgotten what your question was, but sorry. Anyway, the point is, we just have to, unfortunately, we are going to be the women who have had it difficult, but we've had it difficult to allow the next generation of women to come through. And that's going to have to be the cross that we bear. But I hope that it's worth it. And I think it will be.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Lindsay, Lillian, Kate and Kiva. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your contribution. We've heard a lot today about women's experiences in public life and in the workplace now and over the past 25 years. Let's hear about the current state of play for the Equality Commission and its recommendations for the future. Delivering equality for women in Northern Ireland. Now, Darren McKinstry is Director of Public Policy and Strategic Engagement, leading a team of expert staff to shape reform of the law and public policy. He works with key stakeholders, including the government, to raise awareness and secure real change. Please welcome to the stage Darren McKinstry. Thank you, Darren.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to take 10 minutes to focus on delivering equality. And in doing so, I'm going to briefly share some of the Commission's views on some of the key building blocks that we feel need delivered on. And hopefully much of that will echo with some of the key points that you've heard already today. But I also want to highlight some of the key challenges that we feel must be taken seriously and must be overcome if we're actually going to see any meaningful change. So we've heard much today about the journey, the barriers, the progress, but also the challenges. And if that's the last 25 years, what must we see delivered, not just in the future, but now, if we're to see gender equality advanced? So picking up on the need to address the structural issues that was just talked about, it should come as no surprise that one of the key building blocks to advance equality has to include a prioritised strategy and a resourced action plan for gender equality. From what you've heard today and from what you've brought into the room today, you'll be well aware of the wide range of matters that a gender equality strategy could contribute to addressing. For example, in Northern Ireland, women are 5 times more likely than men to be economically inactive for reasons of looking after the family or home. And women are also 4 times more likely than men to work in part-time roles, with much of that part-time work being in lower paid roles or with more limited career prospects. And that interaction of employment opportunities, stereotypes about caring roles, the value attributed to caring and to part-time work is one example of how a joined-up strategy could work across those multiple fronts to drive change. So a gender equality strategy is essential as it provides a roadmap, not only for stakeholders, but for government departments by communicating a strategic direction and facilitating joined-up working. And in a very practical sense, it then allows for the direction that can be fed into and built into successive programme for governments. And it communicates to all departments the gender priorities that should be embedded in their own departmental strategies, programmes, policies and delivery plans. And at that point then, a gender equality strategy, it's clear that it's a document of central and key importance. It sets the direction for the future and sets out how we, and as public servants, will support society to develop. Another key building block is ensuring that we have protection from discrimination. And for that, we consider that we need law reform. By way of some examples of the need there, when compared with Great Britain, women in Northern Ireland currently have less protection from discrimination or harassment by public bodies when those public bodies are carrying out their functions. Further, unlike in Ireland, women don't have immediate employment protections from sexual harassment by a customer or client when they're in work. So in Northern Ireland, we're of the view that our gender equality protections are increasingly falling behind. They're falling behind developments in neighbouring jurisdictions, and they're also falling behind international standards. And as we've just seen from the examples I've just given, we need to see stronger protections with regards to, for example, discrimination and harassment. We also want to see equality law simplified and brought together. We want to see that because it's easier to understand, it's easier to implement, be it for individuals, for employers, or for service providers. And it's consistent then across the grounds. The protections you have as a man or a woman are the same then as the protections you have on other grounds, race, etc. And we consider that the best way to do that is by a single equality law. It's clear from the discussions that we've had today that advancing equality will deliver benefits, not just for individuals, but also for society and the economy. And a key element of that has to be an integrated delivery framework. Now, in the time available today, I can only give the briefest mention to some elements, some of which have already been touched on, but by way of a few examples. Childcare has been mentioned a number of times today. We need to see the delivery of early learning in childcare, and we need to see it in a way that meets the diverse needs of children, of parents, and of those providing care. Delivering for that diversity is key. For example, ensuring it delivers for children with special educational needs, for children and parents whose first language might not be English, or for lone and working parents who may be required to work different hours. A key thing is that one size will not fit all. Another example is that we need to see the implementation of gender pay reporting and also a gender pay strategy to ensure that the structural issues which drive key differences in pay are addressed. For example, the predominance of women in part-time working, as I've set out, and occupations there which typically pay less well. We also need to see the delivery of a comprehensive framework to tackle gender-based violence. We've just heard some very real examples shared by Lindsay and others earlier in the day. And so we need to see the delivery of a violence against women and girls strategy. We need to see the delivery of the proposed domestic and sexual abuse strategy, and also comprehensive hate crime legislation. And we need to see all of those address the specific nature of violence as the impact on women and men, not on a gender-neutral basis. Underpinning all of that, and again touched on by a number of speakers today and questions, we also need to see comprehensive action to address negative stereotypes and promote positive attitudes. And we need to see that from an early age, and we need to see it across all areas of life, including school, training, work, and in the family, including with regards to stereotypes about who provides care and how and when that's provided. So if those are some of the key building blocks, my presentation is about delivering equality, so I want to look at the question of delivery. Delivery matters. Delivery really matters because it's delivery that makes the difference for individuals and for society. And a key point that I want to underscore over a few examples that I'll show in a second is that knowing it needs done is not the same as getting it done, and working towards getting it delivered is not the same as getting it delivered. So by way of a few examples, law reform, we've touched on this across the day, are the legal provisions, by and large based on laws established in the 70s, and despite the Commission and others calling for change for 2 decades now really, what we have seen is limited reform or piecemeal reform, and in some cases where it's been required to keep pace with European directives. And that's in contrast to fundamental developments we've seen in neighbouring jurisdictions. In 1998 to 2000, Ireland delivered an updated equality law framework to the benefit of women, but also those from across a range of equality grounds. And in 2021, Ireland began a further review to further update their equality law framework. In 2010, Great Britain delivered an updated equality law framework via the Equality Act, harmonising their protections and again delivering benefits for women and those from across a range of equality grounds. And yet, in Northern Ireland, we have not yet seen delivery. Another example touched on, Kiva mentioned it a minute ago, on with regards to gender pay. Again, Great Britain in 2010 provided for gender pay reporting and subsequently implemented it in 2017. And gender pay reporting was incorporated into the 2016 Employment Act in Northern Ireland, but it's never as yet been implemented in Northern Ireland. And meanwhile, since then, in Ireland, in 2021, the Gender Pay Gap Information Act has been passed and has already commenced in being implemented. And as Roisin mentioned, in 2023, the EU passed the Pay Transparency Directive, with implementation to occur by 2026. And yet in Northern Ireland, we have not seen delivery. The final example I'll give is childcare, one that's been touched upon many, many times today. And again, Kiva mentioned how long. You know, we've had positions on it for almost 2 decades, and in 2013, mindful of opportunities, we updated our detailed research and set out a policy position, and there were consultations running into 2013 and 2015, and NDNA made a political commitment in 2020. And certainly we're aware DE are proceeding with development work and have been undertaking stakeholder engagement, and we also welcome the range of political commitments being made. But in Northern Ireland, we've not yet seen delivery. So I mention these examples to underscore the gravity of the challenge. Knowing it needs delivered is not enough. Saying it's a priority is not enough. Working towards getting it done is not enough. We need to see that delivery. And it's a salutary lesson that when the Commission made its childcare recommendations in 2013, we noted the difficult economic climate on the back of the 2007 crash and the subsequent austerity drive. And when we updated our recommendations in 2020 to take account of the circuit climate due to the pandemic, and now with the new Executive and Assembly, as we update our recommendations again to engage there, we note again the difficult economic climate. So we have to take the current difficult economic climate not as a barrier to proceeding, but actually the very reason to proceed, to invest to the benefit of the economy, to society, and to individuals from across the range of equality grounds. So we need to see action now. So one additional point that I'll flag before I close just, and those of you working in this area long enough will be well aware of this other cautionary point that I'm going to give. It's learned from previous strategies, including the gender equality strategy. And that is that despite commitments in NDNA agreement to develop a new suite of equality and social strategies, including gender, we've been without a gender strategy now for almost a decade. And the lesson from that strategy and many other equality strategies is that development of a strategy itself does not guarantee delivery. And I think, you know, as we hopefully are now going to move towards seeing strategies, I think it's important to note a lesson from the review of that previous strategy, which said that the strategy was a positive step, but progress against it was limited, and implementation and monitoring could be improved. And that was a review that was conducted very near the end of the life of that strategy. So, where do we go from here? Certainly with the restoration of the Executive and the Assembly, we have the opportunity of renewed leadership. And we need that leadership to drive delivery. Across the room here today, it's very clear that we have a breadth of expertise and many, many examples of partnership working. So it's vital that the co-design element of that does remain a key design, not just of design, but of delivery, and also of rolling review. That's for the gender equality strategy, but all other strategies of government. We do need to see resourced delivery. A crucial point is not only the strategies, but a time-bound and resourced action plan. Strategies and frameworks aren't enough. We do need interventions to be targeted, and we do need impacts to be tracked. And facilitating that will be a comprehensive collection of equality data. If we're serious about delivering equality, then all key measures of government should be broken down and tracked across the full range of equality grounds. So, that's me. I hope that's helpful. I hope it set out some key building blocks. Please continue to press for actual delivery. The Commission's work, as with many of yourselves, is centred on partnership. So please be in contact if you feel we can work together to advance some of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Very helpful, Darren, and a very strong message as we look to the future that so much needs to be done and, as you said, needs to be delivered as well. And on the theme of gender equality strategy, let's hear now on video from Anne-Marie Gray, Professor of Social Policy at Ulster University. Anne-Marie.
Without a gender equality strategy, we'll continue to see the negative consequences for society in Northern Ireland, for our economy and for women's human rights. It's really imperative that this is done now so that we can incorporate the provisions of the strategy into a new programme for government, together with a set of quality indicators for monitoring and evaluation.
Okay, our thanks to Anne-Marie for that. Now, as we draw to a close this afternoon, I want to remind you, don't forget to fill in your evaluation form that you'll find on the table there. The organisers would really, really appreciate you giving your input and your feedback on that. Now, I'd like to invite to the stage our conference partners who are going to close the conference today. And while they come up, I want to remind you of our first video. If you remember earlier today, we had a message from Mary Burke, and she told us that as a woman in 1971, she had to resign her civil service job because of a marriage bar. Effectively, she wasn't allowed to continue to work because she was now married. Well, here is a message and a powerful appeal from Una, who is one of Mary's granddaughters. Here's Una.
Hi, I'm Una. My granny opened the conference. My life is very different to hers in many ways because things have changed so much already. But I hope you can all leave here today ready to work together to continue to advance equality for all girls and women. Help me to ensure I achieve my dreams.
Well done, Una. Thank you for that. And I hope that we do just that and help Una and all of the young women and girls of her generation to be the best they can be. So we have... Gosh, we've come to the conclusion. Can you believe it? And we're on time. Geraldine McGahey, as you know, is Chief Commissioner at the Equality Commission. Anne McVicker is Director of the Women's Research and Development Agency. And Helen Crickard is Coordinator for Reclaim the Agenda. They are the partners for today. And Anne is going to say a few words.
Afternoon, everybody. So, Women's Resource and Development Agency and Reclaim the Agenda are delighted to be partnering the Equality Commission celebrating its 25th anniversary today. And I think it's very fitting to have this event during International Women's Day week. And you'll note that I've moved that from a day to a week now. So Geraldine set the context brilliantly. And we have had inspiring addresses from the First and Deputy First Ministers, the trailblazing Lady Chief Justice, who took us on a whistle-stop tour of equality law and practice over the past 25 years. And we've heard from all women panels on women in the law, women in work, women in politics, and the impact of Brexit on women in Northern Ireland. And as you would expect, very close to my heart, you've heard the strong voices of women from across the women's community sector. I've spent all my working life, that's 30 years plus, and had the privilege of working alongside women's groups, centres, campaigning, lobbying, advocacy, and leadership organisations. From the mid-80s, when gender equality issues weren't even on the agenda, violence against women and girls rates were high and mostly unspoken about. Childcare provision was scant and in large unaffordable for the average earner. Underrepresentation of women in political and public and particular industry sectors were all very low. And in my experience, it's those grassroots women's organisations that have led the way in tackling these issues. Through campaigning for the elusive childcare strategy, with a rolled out, accessible and affordable childcare infrastructure, abortion and reproductive health care, domestic abuse and sexual violence legislation to bring Northern Ireland in line with the UK and not being left behind as usual, and not forgetting the women trade union members who fought for 12 years and won the work for equal pay for equal work, as well as highlighting issues in the workplace such as the need for menopause policies, women's health issues, sexual harassment, domestic abuse and violence. And all of these women are all leading the way in bringing about a much needed cultural shift in Northern Ireland society. By raising awareness of the issues, voicing their lived experiences, lobbying with departments and ministers to push for legislative change, as well as continuing to collaborate with the Equality Commission, bringing a wealth of experience and acting as a conduit by highlighting the obstacles preventing true gender equality. So in summing up, all the speakers today have acknowledged the progress that has been made over the past 25 years. And yes, there's still much more to do. However, in the week that we're in, it's time to celebrate, come together, and reflect on the next part of the journey. Peace and courage is our theme for International Women's Day. Peace, because peace needs to happen now internationally. And courage, because it takes courage to speak out when a powerful majority try to silence you. So on Saturday, the 9th of March, we are expecting a massive gathering and rally for International Women's Day in Belfast. We'll be meeting in Ryder Square at 11 o'clock and heading off at 12 noon to City Hall for speeches. You are all very welcome. Women, men, young people, children, and dogs. So, I'd like to wish you all a happy International Women's Day for Friday. Thank you, and solidarity.
Thank you, Anne. That's terrific. Well, thank you all for being here today. It's been my privilege to share the whole day with you, to hear from so many powerful women from all facets of life. It's a great experience, and it's the way we learn from each other, I think, and we move forward. And as we mark International Women's Day, or International Women's Week, I like that idea, we think about those who came before us, who made a difference in our lives. Our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts, our cousins, especially those women of strength. We stand on the shoulders of those women who ploughed the field before us, and all we can do now is pay it forward to the next generation so that their lives are a little bit easier and they achieve equality. So wishing you all well. Safe journey home.